Merci, Monsieur le Président. Before I deliver my introductory remarks, let me express our deep consternation and extreme frustration for not being able to engage with you fully in the ID now or on Monday morning when the ID resumes. Our Geneva schedule was planned on the assumption that it would be concluded today. We think it is unbefitting of the intense gravity of the situation in Syria today that our in-person engagement with the Council has in effect been reduced to this, my opening remarks that I began to present to you. As world attention and resources shift toward other grave political humanitarian crises, Syria descends further in a quagmire of misery and despair, multiple failures and missed opportunities. We have seen 13 years of internal armed conflict brought about by the Syrian state's violent and repressive response to peaceful demonstrations. Our report documents arbitrary detentions with state officials continuing to forcibly disappear, torture and ill-treat detainees in their custody, despite the ICJ's order in November last year that Syria cease torture. Online activists and journalists are detained, often incommunicado, for criticizing the government. Officials and intermediaries demand bribes from family members who seek to contact or visit detained family members, or to get them released, or even just to obtain information on their whereabouts. The failure of the state to change its ways is compounded by the failure of armed non-state actors that control Syrian territory to forge a different approach to governance, one that protects basic rights and freedoms. In the northwest of the country, HTS and some factions of the SNA continue to detain, torture and disappear civilians and those perceived as political opponents, while at the same time political activists detained by the SDF in northeast Syria. In the northeast, tens of thousands of women and children remain trapped in camps in cruel and inhumane conditions. They include Yazidi women and children 10 years after the Yazidi genocide. Beyond the state and non-state armed groups, we note the appalling failure of the global coalition against Daesh that has been present in Syria since 2014, 10 years ago. Daesh attacks in Syria this year are reportedly on course to double compared to the year 2023. Alongside the stalled peace process, efforts by the international community to bring the conflict to an end have also failed. Fighting has intensified along multiple front lines, taking a heavy toll on civilians. In incidents in the northwest of the country, at least 150 civilians, half of them women and children, were killed and injured by government forces, the vast majority indiscriminate ground attacks near frontline villages and towns. In Deir ez-Zor, there has been a resurgence of violence, with government forces now backing a coalition of tribal fighters against the SDF. In just 1 week, in early August, 65 civilians were reportedly killed or injured in attacks along the banks of the Euphrates River. Fighting displaced thousands of families, destroyed civilian property, and hampered humanitarian assistance, with reports of civilian infrastructure, including water stations and schools, used for military operations. Tensions between the SDF and SNA fighters have intensified in northern Aleppo, with mutual shelling and cross-line assaults, and renewed reports of civilian casualties by vehicle-borne IED attacks in July and August. In central Syria, we see increasing armed attacks, kidnapping, and use of IED, reportedly by Daesh. Civilians continue to be killed on a daily basis in a senseless war that has left the country economically and politically broken, dramatically eroding the social fabric of the country. While people strive to maintain their dignity amidst daily challenges, they are forced to navigate predatory practices by local security forces and factions across the country, ranging from extortion at checkpoints to confiscation of land and properties and kidnapping or arbitrary detention. Living conditions are increasingly desperate, and the international community failed to fund more than a quarter of the United Nations 2024 humanitarian response plan. Just to shock you, I repeat, not more than a quarter of the UN's 2024 humanitarian response plan. Northwest Syria is now home to 4.2 million people, of whom 80% are IDPs, having fled war multiple times by now. Their funding shortage have already shut down 100 health facilities. OCHA has warned that half of all health facilities in Syria will have to fully or partially cease operations by this December, severely affecting mostly women and children living in tents, faced with illness resulting from water shortage and poor sanitation. In the Northeast, an already severe water, fuel, and electricity crisis has been compounded by strikes on civilian infrastructure. Malnutrition rates have risen dramatically, including among young children. Overall, Syria's GDP has shrunk by more than half since 2011, a result of the combined effect of destruction of infrastructure and economic networks, forced displacement of more than half of the Syrian population, predatory practice, and rampant corruption. While elites seem shelter from the prolonged humanitarian and economic crisis, we are concerned that sanctions further deepen Syria's economic abyss and aggravate already dire living conditions of the civilian population, particularly sectoral sanctions. This is particularly urgent as humanitarian funding has increasingly dwindled over the last few years, and the humanitarian response plan, as I mentioned, is severely underfunded. I think this is an understatement, underfunded. The heightened regional tensions stemming from the conflict in Palestine have led to intensify Israeli airstrikes, and last week a raid into Syria, targeting Iranian officials and militias across Syria, causing civilian casualties, and on at least 3 occasions, Iranian affiliate groups and the US have stepped back attacks on each other in northeast Syria since the start of the Gaza war. In recent months, you have been alerted to the dangers to the system of international law itself if the member states charged with upholding it are seen to fully failing in this obligation. We are truly shocked that there has been no worldwide condemnation of the simultaneous widespread attacks using handheld devices that have this week terrorized the people in Lebanon and resulted in thousands of casualties, including in Syria. Excellence, I'm almost concluding. It should amaze you that Syrians across the country still resort to protests in the streets. Most recently, we have seen protests against the HES in the Northwest, against the SNA in the North, against the SDF in the Northeast, and against the government in Soweto. These protests should spur us to overcome the failures I have highlighted. Non-state actors in control of territory need to focus on why the Syrian people rose up in 2011 and began to systematically address the real and ongoing grievance and indeed aspirations of the people. The human rights situation will only get worse unless the international community pays renewed attention to the Syria crisis. Member states need to do more on the humanitarian front. The Syrian people deserve to live in dignity, exercising their fundamental rights and freedoms. They look to this Council to help them get there. Merci, Monsieur le Président.